Okay, so in this example, I want to go ahead and install a web server on our Linux EC2 instance. And eventually I want to take a file from my local workstation, so the workstation that I'm screencasting from, and deploy a file out to my EC2 instance. So a file from my local machine out to my EC2 instance. I'm going to use SSH to do that, or SCP to do that. So I've started my EC2 instance because I wouldn't be able to connect to it otherwise. And then I'm going to go over to my terminal and I'm going to use that SSH command. I'm going to say -I. And then the key file is on my desktop. So I'm going to say in my desktop, there's an matc demo.pem. And then I'm connecting to Ubuntu and then I'm using this public DNS. Whoops, I have something else in my clipboard. So that's not going to work. I want to copy this public DNS. So ssh-i desktop matc demo and then Ubuntu and then that EC2 instance. Okay, so I'm connected. It tells me there's some updates that need to happen. That they're not necessary right now. What I want to show you though is the way Apache is going to work in Linux is Apache is going to use the var www directory as your root web server directory. So what I want to do is I want to kind of show you a before and after snapshot of that var www directory. So if I go to the var directory and do a directory listing, you'll notice there is no www. So there is no www now because I haven't installed Apache. I want to install Apache. After that, we should see that www directory there, and that's where we'll put our files that we want to actually serve through our web server. Okay, so if I want to do this install, I'm going to do it from a terminal. There's a package called apt-get, and that's what I'm going to use to install Apache 2. So I'm using that apt-get install Apache 2. It's going to fail because right now I'm running as the Ubuntu user account. Okay, it's telling me that the permissions denied to lock that file, cannot open a lock file, unable to acquire the lock, are you root? So it's kind of hinting at the fact that I'm not a privileged account right now, and that's the way Amazon's using to secure your EC2 instance. So if I want to run that command as a root user account, I can do that. Okay, so I'm putting sudo in front of it, which basically means super user do or sudo. It's basically run that command as an administrative account. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and install it. Yes, that's fine. Okay, and now if I do a directory listing, you'll notice that www directory is there. This is the directory. I think it's actually the HTML folder in newer versions of Ubuntu. So if I go into the HTML folder, this is where we're going to see our HTML file. Okay, so we've installed our web server, and I want to check what's the status of that. So there's another command that I want to run, which is system control. And then I can get the status of my new service that I just installed, which is Apache 2. Okay, so it's loaded, and it's active, it's running. So life's good there. Okay. I can use that same command to stop it. And I can use that same command to start it back up. Okay, so Apache's installed, we're happy. The next trick to this is if I go out to a browser, I should be able to type in that public DNS entry, and the hope is that Apache's running correctly on that server, and it's going to serve up that shell HTML page. So I've installed Apache, and you saw from my terminal that there was an HTML page there. So when I did that directory listing, it said there was this index.html file. the hope is that it would serve up that index.html file. And you're going to see that it doesn't work. And the reason why is because my default EC2 instance has a firewall in place that's going to block incoming traffic. So I'm not going to be allowed to access my web server. It's working. I just can't access it. And the way I can kind of prove that it's working is if I'm on a terminal window, so I'm on that server, so I don't have any firewall rules in place that would cause a problem, I can use that curl command and localhost, and it'll show that that page is getting rendered out. So it's that Apache 2 main configuration file. This is that HTML that is sitting there, that index.html file. Okay, so it's there. I just can't access it because I can't reach that site. The firewall is causing a problem. So what I want to do is I want to open up the firewall on my EC2 instance so that I can access that page. What is if I go to this instance, so my running instance, then in the left-hand menu there's the security settings. So if I go to network and security, and a couple of things about this. So my instance right now is attached to a security group. It's that Launch Wizard 1, and then I can view the inbound rules and outbound rules. So Launch Wizard 1 was the security group, and then there's inbound rules, which is my firewall rules, and my outbound rules, which are also my firewall rules. So I want to view the inbound rules for Launch Wizard 1, and you'll see that port 22 is allowed. Port 22 is my SSH port. So what I want to do is I want to go to the security groups, and I want to look at this Launch Wizard 1, and I want to look at the inbound rules for that. So if I scroll down, I should be able to edit the inbound rules. Okay, so SSH is there, which is great. I want to add another rule for HTTP, and that's going to be port 80 traffic, and I'm going to save those rules. I want to do the same setup, and I want to save those rules. Okay, so I've saved the inbound rules for my EC2 instance. Basically, I've opened up port 80, and now you'll notice that I'm able to access my Apache Ubuntu default page. Okay, so I want to show you how this works a couple of different ways. So we're connected to our EC2 instance from the terminal. If I open up that file, that var www.html file, index.html, so I'm going to modify it using an inline text editor called Nano. So here's this HTML file, and what I want to do is I just want to scroll down until I get to the HTML. Okay, so if I scroll down far enough, eventually I get to the HTML, and at the very top of this, I'm going to just put an h1 tag, cubs stink. Okay, and then I'm going to write it out. So all of the commands from this inline text editor are down below. So these carets are actually the control key. So I'm going to hit Control O to write out the file. It says, do you want to write it to index.html? Sure, so I'm just going to hit Enter. So it writes it, and then I'm going to hit Control X to exit. Okay, and now at the very top of this page, you should see cub stink, and that's because I modified that HTML file. Now, if you're like me, I don't necessarily like working with that inline text editor. I'd prefer to use Atom to create my HTML pages, and I want to use Atom to push out my HTML pages. So I'm going to skip over to Atom, and I'm going to say that I want an HTML file. I use my template, so here's my EC2 demo for Linux, and then I just say H1 cloud for developers, HTML file for testing EC2 web server. Okay, so this is my HTML page that I want to save. I'm going to save it on my desktop as index.html. Okay, so this is just an HTML file, nothing special about it, but I want to take this file from my desktop over to my EC2 instance. Okay, and in order to do that, I'm going to use some SCP commands. So if I just do SCP, I don't get a ton of results. So usually what I like to look up is SCP syntax. And then this hyperx.org, I'll post a link to this in the screencast. So this has information and examples of how I'm going to use SCP. So copy the file from a remote host to a local host. That's not what I want to do. I want to copy the file from the local host to the remote host. Okay, so I want to copy index.html from my local machine to my remote machine, which is my EC2 instance. So this is the syntax that I'm going to use. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to my terminal. I am actually going to open up a new tab in my terminal. So now if I print my working directory, I'm on my local machine. I can change my directory over to my desktop. So there's my index.html file. So what I want to do is I want to copy the file index.html to my remote host. So SCP, the file that I want, index.html, to my destination. So my destination is going to be Ubuntu at, and then I'm going to use this domain name. And then if I go back to the SCP syntax, what happens is I have to supply that remote directory that I want to copy to. So I'm over here, I've got my destination that I want to access. And then I'm going to say that I want that going into the var www HTML directory. Okay, that's where I want to copy that file. Now, when I do this, HTTP port, so I don't want HTTP, that's not the protocol I'm using SCP. So I want that SCP command, but I don't want to use the HTTP prefix there. So I'm going to go ahead and try to copy that, and eventually it fails saying the permission's denied. Okay, so I can't do that, and basically what it's saying is my account does not have permission to do that. So if I try to use that same command, so the previous command that I just issued, if I do sudo right here, I'm saying run as an administrator, so that SCP command's fine. The problem is my Ubuntu account doesn't have permission to write to this var www HTML directory. So if I go to this, so I went over to my EC2 instance, and I'm on the file system here. If I go up a directory and I list all of the permissions, you'll see that the root user account has read, write, and execute permissions, but the Ubuntu user account doesn't have read, write, and execute permissions. So what I want to do is I want to change the owner of that account, or that directory, to be my Ubuntu account. So I'm going to change the owner to Ubuntu for the HTML directory. And now if I do a directory listing, you'll see that the Ubuntu account is the owner, and the Ubuntu account has read, write, and execute permissions. Okay, so now if I go back and try to run that previous command, now you'll notice I still got a permission denied. Why did I get a permission denied? I still have a permission denied. I wonder, again, I'm going to go back over to this directory, so I'm going to go into the HTML folder. And because I already have an index.html file, and that's owned by the root user account, I don't have permission to write over it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove that file. Okay, so it's gone completely. If I try to load my web server, you'll notice it doesn't work. All it says is here's a directory listing and there are no files. And now if I go back over to my terminal and try to copy my file, I should have permission to copy that file. So you'll notice now finally it's gone. And now if I do a reload of my web server, you'll notice that it's my HTML page that I'm copying out to my web server. Okay, so now I'm able to deploy my HTML files, my JavaScript files, things like that, over to my web server. One last thing that I want to point out is if I go back over to Atom, and let's say I wanted to host a PHP file. Okay, so I want to host a PHP file. Here's a new PHP file, echo hello world. and closing PHP tag. I'm going to save it as index.php. Okay, so that file exists. I want to move that over to my web server. So the file name is no longer index.html, it's index.php. Okay, so eventually it gets copied. If I go to my web server right now, my web server is not set up to support PHP. Okay, so all it's going to do is it gives me the source code. It doesn't actually echo out that hello world message. So it's not actually running that PHP code. In order for that to happen, I have to enable PHP on the web server. Okay, so if I want to do that, I'd have to figure out what the latest version of PHP is. So I'm guessing I can just go to like PHP 7. So I want to install PHP 7. So I'm going to do sudo apt-get install PHP 7. Unable to locate the package. I think it might be 7.3. Nope. So I'm going to just do a quick Google search, apt-get PHP. And looks like it's just PHP with no versioning. Okay, so PHP is going to get installed, which is great. So then my web server will support PHP. Okay, and then I have to do one other thing. I have to change my web server configuration file so that it knows about PHP. My web server configuration file is in the etc Apache 2.7.2. So I'm going to do a2 nmod, which is Apache 2 enable mod PHP 7.2. And I can't remember if it's 7.2 or 7.2. Let's try 7.2. Okay, so it tells me it's already enabled. And what I want to do then is I want to restart Apache. So Apache control restart. Okay, and now that I've restarted it, now what will happen is you'll notice that I'm able to serve up that PHP file and it actually renders that PHP code. So now we have a web server that'll host our HTML and it'll render out any PHP code that we'd want to run.